Awesome. YouTube looks good.
Yep.
Hopefully everything can see the live stream. Great. All right. Thanks, guys. Thanks for coming. We had a great talk for you today, starting with news roundup by Nash and Yusuf. Nash filled in for us today, and if anybody wants to, be part of the news, just give me a heads up or give me a shout. We are implementing CCR for the next entire year, and hopefully for the years beyond that. So if anybody contributes to anything we do at the club, you'll get credit on your transcript towards that. So if you want to do part of news, if you want to do if we have a Defcon week debrief today, if you want to do something like that, if you wanted to have your own presentation, definitely give us a shout and you can get credit towards that, assuming you're a Sheridan student. So we're going to start with the news roundup by Nash and Yusuf. After that, we'll do the Defcon week debrief. I'm sorry. I hear a mic. 1 sec. Sure. Okay, there you go. So we have the news roundup. After that, we have the Defcon week debrief, and then we'll have the Active Directory by Alex Kozlov. He's he currently works at Access 2 Networks, and he's the team lead for penetration testing at that red team division. So he has a really interesting talk surrounding attacking Active Directory, and you want to stick around for that. Before we move on to the news roundup, I just want to mention that if you remember, a couple months back, we said we were working on a new website. We're still doing that, and as soon it'll hit beta, and then hopefully we can transition the entire old website onto the new one and make that smooth before the semester starts. And then so when we do post that, a link to that, give us your feedback on what you like, what you dislike, what's working, what's broken, and we really appreciate any feedback you guys can give us. Without further ado, I'll hand it over to Nash, and he can start, and him and Yusuf can start with the news roundup.
Thanks, Kurt. My name's Yusuf, if you haven't already. And
Hi, Yusuf.
Anyways,
I love you, Yusuf.
You can ignore these goofballs, and then alongside me is my good buddy Nash. We'll get the news going for you guys today. So to start, the first article is on how Safari patched this bug, but nearly takes a year to patch it. So essentially, there was a security hole that could leak files with other browsers and applications. The researcher who found this bug attributed the bug to Safari's implementation of the Web Share API, which allows users to share links from the browser via third-party applications, such as those distributed via mail and messaging apps. The bug would allow access to files stored on users' local hard drive and unknowingly share their personal files and data with a malicious site when assuming they're only sharing an article or a link with their friends. To do this, a link is passed to the navigator.share function. An actual file from the user's file system is included in the shared message, which leads to a local file disclosure when a user is sharing it unknowingly. The researcher did say the problem is not very serious because it actually requires a user to take action rather than allowing the attacker to remotely control someone's system without their knowledge. The researcher also said that he had much back and forth with Apple when he first found the bug, but when he told them, Apple said that they would resolve it in spring 2021. And as you could imagine, this prompted the researcher to reveal his findings to the public. And as such, Safari released the patch for this bug.
Great. So there's a new malware that was found in attacks from North Korea that targeted U.S. and foreign companies in the military and defense aerospace sectors. What's interesting is the social engineering that was used. The way attackers went about carrying out their attack was to pretend to be recruiters from large companies. They would recruit employees working in these sectors with potential job offers and ask that they go through the interview process. Part of the process was asking their victims to open documents on their machines. These documents contain the payload, which is a remote access Trojan, otherwise known as a RAT, called a blinding can. The rat was then able to retrieve information about all installed disks, get operating system version information, get process information, system name, local IP addresses, MAC addresses, search, read, write, and move executable files, and delete artifacts or evidence associated with the malware. This is the 35th time that the US government has issued a security alert about North Korean malicious activity. They're trying to deter attacks from foreign and domestic entities by criminally charging hackers. They also set up a $5 million reward program for anyone who can provide information on the North Korean attacker's location as well as plan.
Great. So this one is how Twitter took down the Dracula botnet that was pushing pro-Chinese propaganda. So essentially, a research group called Graphica found around 3,000 bots that pushed pro-Chinese propaganda on Twitter. Most of the accounts used quotes from Bram Stoker's Dracula book, hence the name Dracula. And I tried looking into this book and finding what it was about, and I found a couple things, but nothing concrete that I wanted to assume things off of. So the bots were discovered early, unlike other incidents involving Chinese bots that occurred in late 2019 and mid 2020. This is good because the botnet was only able to mask 3,000 accounts, and the oldest date only went back to July 2020. Twitter said that these accounts are not dangerous. However, they were able to get predetermined topics trending, and the group said it's unclear whether these accounts were suspended through Twitter's algorithms or whether they were manually suspended through the employees of Twitter.
There was a researcher who also wanted to see if there were personal medical data on GitHub. It turns out that there was, or still is, and it took less than 10 minutes to find credentials with simple queries, including a Medicaid password FTP. It turns out that a developer of a company has broken some key security practices, which include embedding hard-coded login credentials in code instead of making them a configuration option on the server the code runs on, using public repositories instead of private repositories, failing to use two-factor or multi-factor authentication for email accounts, and abandoning repositories instead of deleting them when no longer needed. So these bad practices caused a leak of over 150,000 patient records. At first, the researcher attempted to contact the company to advise them of his findings, but then when they didn't respond, he published an article on databreach.net. And when databreach.net tried to responsibly disclose the findings to the company, they didn't respond due to fear of social engineering attack. These errors went undetected for months because of negligent security policies at the companies in charge of the data. So what's the learning lesson? Well, companies need to put proper measures in place to know who has access to their data, where it's being stored, and what platforms it's being used in.
I think it's also interesting to add like how often like the times I've done the news that GitHub and things like GitHub are popping in due to kind of like, I don't want to say stupid things, but kind of dumb errors by people like this.
Right.
Yeah. So Cisco patches several high-severity bugs impacting their switches and fiber storage. The bugs impact their network gear, including switches and fiber storage. Now, these Cisco's NX OS was hit hardest with 6 security alerts tied to the network OS. This resulted in it impacting the Nexus series Ethernet switches and the MDS series fiber channel storage. Two of the main updates, or two of the main vulnerabilities, that were listed was CVE 2020-3397, and this one was due to incomplete input validation of a specific type of BGP MVPN update message. An attacker could exploit this vulnerability by sending the specific valid BGP MVPN update message to a targeted device. What this would allow is it would allow for either a partial or prolonged denial of service attack via session resets and device reloading. The second one, the CVE 2020-3398, was due to incorrect parsing of a specific type of the same variable. And other bugs that were listed also include vulnerabilities that could, again, lead to denial of service attacks remotely and injecting arbitrary code. Overall, 9 switches were impacted because of these bugs.
So for our next article, the SANS Institute had an incident where one of their employees fell victim to a phishing attack resulting in a data breach. The data breach resulted in losing around 28,000 records of personally identified information, or PII. For those who don't know what the SANS Institute is, SANS is a cybersecurity training service provider and highly regarded in the InfoSec industry, which is why this incident has raised a lot of attention. It indicates that the world's best security training firm isn't invulnerable to data breaches. The breach was discovered on August 6th of this year while the company's IT team was carrying out a systemic review of its email configuration and rules. The team noticed a suspicious forwarding rule along with a malicious Microsoft Office 365 add-in. These two sources collectively forwarded 513 emails from the employee's email account to an unknown external email. There are a few entities that are better equipped than SANS to perform the incident's response using their own personnel. So their forensics instructors are investigating the incident, as well as they'll be using this as an educational opportunity for themselves and the community, and will be hosting a webcast to share their findings.
Cool. So Lazarus Group is targeting admins at cryptocurrency firms via phishing messages on LinkedIn. The goal of this scheme was obviously financially motivated, and it was to harvest credentials necessary for accessing cryptocurrency wallets or online bank accounts. Essentially how it works, I mean, we all know how phishing schemes work, but they depend on where the group wants to go with it. But essentially, the group sends a phishing document to admins' personal accounts, posing as a legit job posting, and it meets all the skills that the employee has. Once the target clicks on that document that is actually claimed to be protected by general data protection regulation, it would prompt a user to enable macros in Microsoft Word. Once the user then enables macros, malicious macro code would execute and create an LNK file that results in the execution of a exe file called mshtaexe, which then calls out to a bit.ly link. And it's important to kind of note here that this link was accessed 73 times from at least 19 countries. After that bit.ly link is clicked, it then redirects them to a domain which executes Visual Basic script to gather information on the host computer. Eventually, this leads to a download and execution of a PowerShell script from a C2. And after the full payload is completely installed, it has the ability to download additional files, decompress data in memory, initiate C2 command, execute arbitrary commands, and steal credentials from a number of sources. Despite disabling Windows Defender monitoring as one of the first steps that the attackers did to try and avoid detection, many of the commands executed would actually give blue teams huge leads into the steps that the attackers took to gain access and to take control over a victim's host.
So for our next article, Mozilla has released their newest version of Firefox, version 80. This is the newest version, which fixes a number of critical vulnerabilities and exposures, or CVEs. Some key CVEs to note are CVE 2020-15670, a memory corruption bug that was able to run arbitrary code via unauthorized users. CVE 2020-15663, which allowed for administrative privilege escalation if updater.exe was executed from the install location. CVE 2020-15664, which could have caused malicious browser installation by accessing the install trigger object through the eval function from an about blank window, and CVE 2020-6829, which allowed for electromagnetic side channel attack. They have published a document outlining all of their bug fixes, but a key takeaway would be update your browser.
Is Yusuf still here?
Hello, who's up next? Yusuf?
Yeah, it should be useful.
Sorry guys. I was totally talking but muted. My apologies.
No worries, dude.
So yeah, essentially what I said was Biodefenders is a cyber threat intelligence lab, and it discovered an instance of an espionage attack targeting an unnamed international architectural and video production company. Essentially what they're calling this hack is hackers for hire, simply because what happened here was something that hasn't really been seen that often before, but essentially a actual organization, a legit organization, would hire a group to attack a competitor, and so that's why they got the name Hackers for Hire. The group infiltrated the company using tainted and specifically crafted plugin for Autodesk 3ds Max. The command and control infrastructure used by the cyber criminal group to test their malicious payload against the organization's security solution is actually located in South Korea. Autodesk did release a warning its users about a variant of the script, which is called PHYSX plugin MFX Max script. This exploit that would corrupt 3ds Max's systems, run malicious code, and propagate to other Max files on a Windows system. I have a picture of how this entire thing works, but one thing I do want to note is the final payload would be able to capture screenshots and gather passwords from web browsers such as Firefox, Chrome, and Internet Explorer. If you go to the next slide, I will quickly go over this sort of diagram explaining how everything goes. So essentially what's happening is as you download that plugin, once you restart 3ds Max or Autodesk, it's okay, sorry, whatever. It's essentially what it does is it executes these startup scripts, which go through a series of steps that I'm not going to go through all of them for time's sake. But essentially, they go communicate with other domains, and it at the end receives a DLL, which acts as the backdoor component, and through that, it is able to execute essentially the commands that the attackers want.
Right. For our next article, a Mitiga researcher has found an Amazon Machine Instance, or AMI, in this case a Windows 2008 server that has been infected with a Monero mining script. AMIs are essentially virtual machines that are developed by third parties and made available through Amazon Web Services or AWS Marketplace. The reason why companies may use these services is to lower their costs for computing power by relying on the computing power of the vendor providing the service. The researcher found Monero mining scripts during a security audit for a financial service company and concluded that the sole purpose of the AMI was to infect devices with the crypto mining script. The problem that arises is not just cryptojacking, which has become a recent trend and can yield to a pretty penny, but the bigger question arises of what other malicious activity can be hidden within the AMI. For instance, an AMI install can have a backdoor on business computers or ransomware used to extort companies by encrypting their files. When Amazon was asked how this could happen, and what their approach was to handling the unverified AMI publishers, they declined to comment. Review of their AWS documentation revealed the caveat that users should use community AMIs at their own risk, and Amazon can't vouch for the integrity or security of these AMIs.
Okay, so this was kind of interesting. Essentially, what's going on here is, I mean, we've heard about a lot of Chinese issues lately within TikTok and a bunch of stuff like that. But this specifically doesn't have to do with TikTok. It has to do with a company called Mantegrio. And essentially, they have an SDK that's being accused of spying on users' activity. Essentially, it's been found in more than 1,200 apps, and that overall has around 300 million installs per month since July 2019. Yeah, so the SDK is distributed as a regular ad network, something that developers can use to monetize their apps through ads. Once it's loaded, the SDK injects code into standard iOS functions within the application that execute when the application opens a URL. This includes App Store links from within the actual app. This would lead to a significant access of data and even potentially private user information. The SDK also specifically examines these open URL events to determine if a competitor's ad network SDK was the source of the activity. The article uses this as a reason to say that this is a major issue for the advertising ecosystem. And essentially, the SDK could intercept all HTTP requests from apps it was integrated into.
For our next article, the FBI arrested an Indian national on fraud-related charges for a large tech support scam. He became an FBI informant and gave up the names of 3 of his collaborators. The informant also broke down the components of the scam. The first role is that of the publisher, who creates the tech support website and posts online ads on platforms like Facebook. When users click on these ads, they're directed to the malicious site, which may display a pop-up or error message indicating that there's something wrong with their machine and provide a number for them to call for support. The second is the broker, who sells call traffic to call centers. Essentially, they charge for a batch of calls. And third, the call center, i.e. the frontline workers. The estimated loss for this operation are believed to be in the millions of US dollars, as the scheme appeared to have been going on since at least 2017. Scammers are targeting people with little or no knowledge of computer security or fraud, like poor little Nona, who's trying to buy jars online to bottle her own ripened tomatoes.
Cool. So this one is, I think, my favorite article that I found. Essentially, what it is this professor from a university in the States that I told myself I would write his name down, but forgot to write his name down, essentially made this simple kit for physically generating a single super secure key that can serve as the basis for creating all the most important passwords in your life for years or even decades to come. Essentially, this is a replacement for other strong ways of identifying and authenticating yourself. However, it's not as easy to lose. The DiceKeys, the product, what he's calling, creates a highly random, mathematically unguessable key. I'll get to that in a second. But essentially, you can use that key to derive master passwords for password managers as the seed to create a UTF key for two-factor authentication, or even as the secret key for cryptocurrency wallets. Most importantly, it is designed to be permanent, offline, and be able to regenerate the master password or crypto key or UTF token if it gets lost or forgotten. So essentially, what you do is you shake the keys inside the bag and dump them into a plastic box. Then using the DiceKeys app, which is hosted at dicekeys.app, you would scan the barcodes to ensure that the scan works correctly. Now, despite the current version being hosted on the web, the professor says that it's designed so that no data ever actually leaves your device. Now, how unguessable are these passwords? Essentially, they have 2 to the 196 different possibilities for how the dice could be positioned. Now, you're probably wondering, well, Yusuf, how big is that? Well, if you remember in Computer Math 1, or you don't, or Computer Math 2, it's a very big number, and I have it right here. It's huge. I'm not even going to attempt to say what that is, but point being, it would take a huge computer, a lot of processing power to even attempt to break such a password.
That's unbreakable.
Exactly. Okay. What curse?
Definitely.
Okay. Perfect. Even better. The article said it was. So, but I'll take your word for it. Huh?
But quantum computers.
Exactly.
You can say that to anything.
Yeah, Jamie, that is exactly what Jeff Bezos' bank account is. That's exactly what it is.
So this one is a little bit of a long one, so bear with me. This article talks about an inefficiency within the Chromium software. Chromium is an open source project that produces software that many browsers use, including wildly popular Google Chrome, but also Vivaldi, Brave, and more recently, Microsoft Edge. When a user wants to go to a website, they enter their URL into the address bar. The browser then sends our request to a DNS server through an ISP. As a reminder, in a nutshell, a DNS server automatically converts human-friendly server names like nba.com into its associated IP address that computers can use to send and receive traffic. In the event that an IP doesn't exist, the DNS server will respond with a DNS error 3, otherwise known as an NX domain, or a non-existent domain. The ISP or internet service provider can use this response to redirect users to a website that the ISP may want the user to go to, for example, to purchase the domain. This practice is known as NX domain hacking and will return an IP to the browser to establish communication. Modern browsers have the ability to perform a search directly from the address bar, and many companies use plain domain names internally so that staff can use single word names to reach internal corporate servers. But how does the browser know what is entered into the address bar is not an external domain if the DNS is always identifying a valid IP? Chromium developers created a feature to help the browser determine if NX domain is hijacking or being implemented, if NX domain hijacking is being implemented by the ISP in a file aptly named Intranet Redirect Detector. Upon startup, the program will try 3 randomly generated domain names which have little likelihood of being an actual external domain. If the DNS returns an IP and that IP is the same for all randomly generated names, then it's likely that the NX domain hijacking is occurring. For many domain names that are entered into the address bar that returns an IP that is the same as the one found during startup, the browser will treat these as search queries. So what's the problem? The issue is that there are millions of users using Chromium-based browsers. If every time the browser starts, there are multiple requests being sent to the DNS server, the server can be bogged down on garbage requests, taking a larger time to handle legitimate requests. This would be analogous to a group of people going to the doctor's office for no reason every day, which will inevitably lengthen the time it would take for a person to see the doctor for a legitimate cause. There are 3 proposed solutions within the article. One would be to make the NX domain connection process less demanding on root servers, or make the auto search detection feature optional, or if the problem persists, turn the feature off by default.
So I'm going to speed through this last article. I'm going to continue on the Google bash, but I'll speed through it because Kurt's probably pulling out his hair right now at the time that we're going at. But essentially, what's happening is Google mitigated a single flaw in its G Suite. However, there is another flaw that I'll get to maybe in 30 seconds that they did not mitigate. Essentially, what's happening is there's these DMARC vulnerabilities which are tied to emails. These DMARC vulnerabilities are significant and hard to find because they give attackers the potential to send emails spoofed from a spoofed address that would appear to be a legitimate email from, say, a coworker, boss, or business partner. Essentially, what happened is the researcher found this flaw, started having a back and forth with Google, and essentially Google said that they didn't want to solve it. The researcher gave them a 137-day window to address the flaw. However, they didn't. Kind of just like that Safari's article I said at the very beginning. But yeah, they didn't. So the researcher published his findings. Then Google immediately, after a couple hours, issued several side mitigations with plans to issue a full patch in September. The second flaw, which Google has not yet patched, is a vulnerability that could be exploited in phishing campaigns to distribute malicious files that appear to be legitimate documents or images. Essentially, Google Drive doesn't validate new versions of a file that have the same extension as an older version, meaning malicious actors can sneakily upload a new version that is actually a malicious executable. With that said, that is the final story. I want to shout out, I think that's Lee watching us on YouTube. He thinks he's finding CNN, so it's kind of cool. But yeah, that's the news, guys. Appreciate you guys for listening. Sorry we took too much time. Kurt will post all these articles, I think, now or after we're done. But if anything was interesting, go check them out.
Yep, I recently just posted them in the news channel.
Sweet.
If you guys want to check them out, go hit them up. By the way, I don't have any hair. I just shaved my own head recently. Not shaved, but I cut my own hair.
No, okay, but you cut it all off.
No. I've been trying to cut my own hair because I'm not going anywhere.
Oh, okay.
So I might as well try it out,
fine.
you know? And it's
fine.
My girlfriend says, hold on, what? How does it look? She said Jesus. Okay, whatever.
Jesus,
anyway.
okay.
But yeah, thanks guys. Thanks for the news. Up next, we have the Defcon Debrief. So basically, Defcon event happened recently, and we want to talk about kind of some of our favorite talks. And I guess to start giving our overview, if Luai, who's starting, Luai or Jamie?
I'm starting.
All right,
Well,
Luai.
okay, well, Jamie's starting, but I'm
Jamie's
introducing.
starting. Okay, hold up. So I'll put Jamie's talk up first because he doesn't have any slides, but I can put up these beautiful people.
That's good.
All right, Jamie, take it away.
No.
Oh wait, sorry.
I'm
starting?
starting.
Okay, Luai starting. Okay.
No. Okay, I'm introducing. Jamie's starting.
You guys fucked me up.
Luai, you're gonna crash your computer again, man. You better stop.
Correct. Okay. All right, let's get started. So, first
Take
of
it away.
all, oh, sorry. Let me introduce. Let me introduce. So, so this is the Defcon Debrief. Hi, everyone. Essentially, the objective of this segment is just to, Defcon just happened, and we just kind of wanted to talk about our favorite talks. The goal is just to encourage kind of everybody in attendance to attend workshops as much as possible. The reason that's important, attending workshops, attending conferences, that kind of stuff, is because you actually do get like quite a lot out of them. So you might be thinking like, how much information can I get from like a 45-minute talk? Sometimes like if it's B-sides, it's like a 20-minute talk, right? And the answer to that is actually quite a lot. So you might not get like a ton of detail per se, but it's a great jumping off point for ideas that you can experiment with at home, ideas that you can take at work. If you work for like a good reputable company, they better encourage you to go to conferences because that's where ideas come from. And that's really where you hear the experts in the field. So with that being said, we have like B-sides coming up soon, I believe. Hackfest is also coming up soon, and the benefit of this year and all of us being at home is the fact that you can actually watch all of those talks online, and you can even participate in some of the workshops online as well. So that's kind of the motivation for this. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce Jamie. Jamie is our ISSessions event manager. Jamie is awesome. So I don't know, apparently people think my voice is great, and people think Kurt's voice is great, and Yusuf's voice is great, and Nishad's voice is great, and Jem's voice is great. But Jamie actually has the best voice among all of us. I actually think Jamie needs to get into radio.
Watch yourself. Watch yourself. Watch yourself.
Descent in the ranks, Louis.
Yeah, man.
Oh
Watch
my God!
yourself.
Did you hear that? Did you hear that? The voice of an angel. So aside from Jamie's voice, Jamie is really cool. He's going to present like an ICS talk for you guys today. He's going to be, it's a Defcon talk, so he's going to be talking about it. Yeah, without further ado, I'll hand over the floor to Jamie. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Yeah, guys, I want to add to what Louis said actually about following the news in these conferences. It's our job. I mean, if we're not staying up to date on current events in the security community, I mean, we're just not doing our job, and we're not doing justice to the program we're all in. So follow the news, go to conferences, and be well read on these subjects. With that being said, you're probably thinking, Jamie's the event manager, right? And what events do we have coming up? Because it's been kind of a quiet summer. We do have an event coming up at the end of September that I'm going to plug really quick, and it's all on Bash. So we're going to be going from 0 to 25 on Bash for everybody that's either scared of the terminal or like isn't that productive. And there'll be more information on that in a few weeks. So back to DEF CON. So DEF CON this year was virtual, which was really cool because I've only ever been able to see it virtual. The only difference this year was that I definitely put my browser in a VM when I was watching it, just out of the fear that, people were going to get a little shady with it. And if you could just throw up the quick YouTube video there on the stream. So this was the talk that really stuck out to me. And you're probably thinking, ICS? You're either thinking, what is that? Or why would someone be interested in that? And I can explain both of those to you. So ICS is Industrial Control Systems. And that just sounds really sexy and exciting. But it's really important. And generally, it's handled by government agencies because just of the sheer magnitude of the projects. And it interests me because I'm actually pathwaying through the military right now to become a cyber operator. And that's kind of why you guys don't see me a lot and why I'm super busy, because I'm effectively working 3 jobs trying to do this military thing. And it's really busy, but it's really rewarding as well. So I'll kind of get into that a little bit later. So back to the talk. This talk was really interesting for 2 reasons. Number one, Chris Krebs, if you don't know who he is, you absolutely should know who he is, because he was the first director of cybersecurity for Homeland Security, and I believe he was sworn in 2018. Now, there's a couple interesting points there. Is that one, that Homeland Security has a head of cybersecurity, which is awesome and crucial, but it's also interesting that they just swore him in 2 years ago, 2018. I think we could have used that 20 years ago, right? So this is how new this field is becoming relevant to governments and agencies and the military. And this is kind of why I want to bring this up, because when I told people what I was doing, they kind of gave me like a sideways look. They were like, you don't want to be in an air-conditioned office, and you don't want to be on top of the newest technologies and all these things. And I said, no, I want to be, in a base on the front lines, like dealing with the worst of the worst. And it's like, well, why would you want to do that? And it's really rewarding. And in this talk, Chris actually explained some really key points as to why it's really good for cybersecurity people to get involved with the civvy side of cybersecurity. Because most of us here, from discussions I've had with you, or I've not had with you yet, basically, we want to get into the private industry because there's a lot of money and there's a lot of work and it's really exciting. But there's also a whole another layer to this where we have governments and institutions that require the same level of cybersecurity as, the tech giants in the Silicon Valley. So Chris kind of talks about how the military and more specifically Homeland Security deal with kind of justifying that, because what happens a lot is people will go into the military or an agency for a few years, and then they'll basically leave and go to the private sector and make a boatload of money, which I'm not going to lie, I might do one day too, because, money's money. But he basically explains that it's really important for the military to bring in new ideas, and actually by contributing to the private sector, it actually can make their job easier because they kind of work asynchronously. And that's really important for all of us to remember, is that while it's really exciting to be working on cutting edge technologies and this and that, there is like real infrastructure, not only in North America, but all across the world that has to be protected. And especially in places right now that are facing, combat situations. I mean, cybersecurity gets even more important because there's, vigilantes and, counter-terrorist groups who are indigenous to their country that are trying to, stay under the radar, but they need to communicate. And cybersecurity is literally a matter of life or death. And that's kind of what Chris talks about, how it's really important to see that perspective of this, because I think it's an easily lost perspective, is that this job is really important. I mean, just recently in the news, 2 Canadian spies that were actually trying to break through the Great Firewall of China were exposed, and now they're being indefinitely held in China because they were exposed through a piece of malware that wasn't even intended to hit them, but it did hit them, and then their identities were exposed, and now they're being held in China. So this is some real serious stuff. And I think it's important as well, because you might be asking, well, you see some American flags there, and Homeland Security is obviously an American agency. And you'll be thinking, Jamie, that's America. We're in Canada here. Get relevant. Well, we actually do have our own version of Chris Krebs, and his name is Scott Jones, and he's the head of the Canadian Institute for Cybersecurity, who is the primary agency in Canada that deals with that. And I would encourage all of you to kind of look into those agencies and what they do, because they do some incredibly amazing stuff. Currently, the military and them are working on a big project with IBM to bring the fully homomorphic algorithms to Canada. And that, really quickly, what that is basically IBM has invented an algorithm that can keep data encrypted 100% of the time. So there's no more need for decryption using their algorithm. And the Canadian military is actually working with them to bring that up here. So there's some really interesting stuff in the ICS field, because now we can bring these new technologies to ICS infrastructure and, nation building across, the world, where we can now really start defending people's freedoms. And in places like China and Hong Kong that are facing, things like facial recognition and literal life or death matters. I mean, we can now bring these technologies to them and support them in escaping these atrocities. And that's what really interested me in this field, is kind of how you can change the world from a computer. And that has never, ever been possible within the last 10 years. I mean, it's really within the last few years where this has become important. And I think all of us need to really remember how important this job is and is going to become as we move to this digital world. And with that being said, that's kind of all I have to say about this talk. And to kind of summarize everything, I think it's really important, guys, that you read the news, stay current, and stay aware of these things going on in the world, and how maybe one day you can help, whether it's through the private sector or it's through, a military pathway or a government agency pathway. There's a lot of different ways to become, a cybersecurity agent, but there's not a lot of ways to be, a good person. And we're very blessed that we have the opportunity to do both. And with that being said, I'd like to hand the floor off to Louis to continue our Defcon debrief.
Sounds good. Before I get started, does anyone have any questions for Jamie? Any comments? Anybody else interested in ICS wants to share something with us? I'll give you 10 seconds.
I love the ethical dilemmas that he threw at us.
Yeah.
Not
yeah,
a question,
I know.
it's just a comment.
But that's perfectly cool too.
I think it's, like I said, it's a lost perspective that there is a real life or death aspect to cybersecurity, because a lot of times we just think of it in terms of money or corporate stability, and those things are important as well, but there's a whole other kind of layer to it that I think a lot of us don't see, because I remember telling people about it, and it was really interesting to see their look. They were like, what are you doing? So yeah, trying to get you
Jamie,
off. Yeah.
So I actually had a question. So, let's say that I want to go into this field, right? I want to go into ICS. What kind of skills would I need? Like, what should I go and read up on in order to get involved in this field?
Yeah, awesome question, Louis. I'll explain it a little bit, and there's actually a lot in this talk about that. But kind of what I would say is the most direct way in Canada is the military, for 2 reasons. And this isn't like, join the army. I'm not, it's not paid advertisement or anything, but they have a really great education program for teaching you hands-on in the field. And I think that's kind of the easiest way to learn it. But if you want to just kind of read up more about ICS, I definitely would check out the Canadian Institute for Cybersecurity. I would read on some of the projects and operations that they're doing, especially right now in what's going on in the Middle East and Hong Kong and China, in places where there's active conflict, and what they're doing to kind of basically protect people's freedoms. And that's like the basis of ICS, is how do we keep infrastructure which is things like, like internet and electricity and water, which all run on some kind of microcontroller or like a programmable logic computer. They all run on some piece of technology that requires cybersecurity, just like every other piece of technology, but it's often overlooked because we think of physical security, right? So I would say, read about real world things, and that's the easiest way to kind of contextualize it, because ICS is a very real practical field where like you will build something and then you will secure it, and then you have to really actionable. So that's what I would recommend, to the way.
Thank you so much for that. I mean, what I've always loved when hearing people speak about ICS is the whole humanitarian perspective. But it's also really interesting as well, because sometimes you're dealing with like protocols that were invented like 40 or 50 years ago, and you have to go and like figure out how they work. And sometimes, along the same vein, you're dealing with some very legacy technology, and so understanding how you want to integrate that with new technology, that's all like super exciting stuff, and it certainly also has that hacker appeal that a lot of us enjoy.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's the hacker appeal, but it's also like the makers and breakers, right? I mean, you're going to understand a technology not just from a software side or from a security side, that you're going to understand how it's interfacing with hardware, how it's interfacing with other devices, with networks. And it's a really good field if you're like me, and I'm kind of like the everyman. I like a little bit of everything, and this is like the field for that, because you have to have an understanding of everything. You have to be competent with everything, but you don't necessarily have to be a master of one thing. And that's something that I think that the government agencies are looking for. They want somebody that they can put anywhere and they'll be able to perform at an acceptable level. And I think that's also really cool too, right? Like if you don't feel like you quite grab onto anything, ICS is a great place to find your passion, because you might figure out that, hey, you actually like the hardware side of security more than software, and vice versa. So it's a really great exploration field as well.
That's awesome. All right, so I'm gonna count to 10. If anybody wants to ask a question, now's your chance, and then I'm gonna move on.
People. I got answers.
I think we are gonna move on because of time.
Oh, okay. Slap on the wrist. All right.
If you do have more questions for Jamie, just shoot him a DM or put him in the stream questions.
Yep, absolutely perfect. Thanks, Kurt.
Cool. So I guess it's my turn. Just really quickly, Lee, what are you doing watching the YouTube channel? Like CNN? We're not CNN. All right. We're gonna talk about this.
I'm CNN. What are you talking about?
Just he was making fun of you.
It's fine. I take things. I don't take things personally. I'm a good guy.
It's okay. It's okay. I do though.
Yusuf's driving to the scene right now.
Okay, so let me get into my portion. So I just have to share my screen really quickly. Give me 1 second. All right. Okay, so you should all see this here. Kurt, can you verify that you can see Open Threat Research? It's like a...
Yep.
Okay, cool. So yeah, essentially the talk well, it actually wasn't a talk. It was a workshop. And this workshop was actually in the Blue Team Village. So Defcon is organized into villages. There's the ICS Village. And I spent most of my time in the Blue Team Village because that's kind of where I'm doing my internship right now. And I wanted to kind of, learn as much as possible now that I'm just starting out in the field. And the workshop that I actually participated in was called Data Analysis for Detection Research through Jupyter Notebooks. What this is a workshop that was done by these two people. They are Roberto Rodriguez and then Jose Rodriguez. Their Twitter handles are CyberWarDog and CyberPanda. And what they're all about, they actually came up with this project called the HELK project. So it's the Hunting, Elasticsearch, Logstash, and Kibana project. And it integrates a whole bunch of different technologies to kind of simplify the process of threat hunting. And for those of you who don't know, threat hunting is essentially the process of trying to find ways to detect adversaries by doing a whole bunch of research on the techniques that they do through, for example, the MITRE ATT&CK framework, or looking at the tools that they use, and then trying to write detections for those. So you might use things like Yara, you might use things like, Sysmon and AuditD, so log providers. And you might use things like various EDR solutions like OS Query, among other things. What these guys actually talk about is the use of this thing called Jupyter Notebooks. And if you've gone through third year with Josh when he taught you cryptography, you've probably used Jupyter Notebooks before. And Jupyter Notebooks are essentially this thing where you can kind of, it uses this thing called the REPL loop. So you can actually, insert, it works in cells, as you can see here. So you would write a piece of code, and then you would essentially click this run button over here, and you would instantly get the output. And the really cool thing about Jupyter Notebooks is that it allows for really cool like data analysis, really cool data visualizations to happen as you code. And this becomes very powerful because you don't actually have to, write your entire script before you can see what is actually happening. The other cool thing about Jupyter Notebooks is that you essentially have your code, you have your documentation, you have your visualizations, and you have these things called data frames, which essentially summarize your data all in one place. And so you can effectively make your code into a report that you can execute whenever you want. And the kind of pipeline or process that you would go through when using Jupyter Notebooks is first you would get some data from somewhere. Then you're going to analyze the data, and then you are going to draw conclusions from the data. And the conclusions from the data could be like a report, or for example, the notebook can be like a hunting notebook. So it's looking for certain IOCs. It's correlating those IOCs together. And once it sees that IOC A, B, and C have been met, it goes and opens a ticket for your a SOC analyst to go and investigate. So they can be quite powerful. The biggest realization that I got from this workshop is that Jupyter Notebooks are essentially a front for kind of a change in the practice of threat hunting and more broadly blue teaming. In a sense, what's happening is we don't want to write rules that target single IOCs. We kind of want to actually do a full kind of incident response procedure in code. And the implication from that is that data analytics is actually starting to play a bigger and bigger role in InfoSec. So if you think about the kind of data that you're generating, you have, for example, your proxy logs, and then you have your host logs, like your Sysmon logs or your AuditD logs if you're using Linux, right? And these logs, each one of these logs perhaps tells half the story of the investigation that you're trying to carry out. What Jupyter Notebooks does is it provides like this really cool interface where you can actually draw information from these multiple sources. You can then enrich this information with external data or internal services that you have in your organization. And then once you've enriched that data and correlated that data until you have kind of like a complete story of what has happened in your network, then you can go and take action based on this information. Sometimes the action is just to provide you with like a visualization that someone can investigate. Other times it's like what I said before, which is opening a ticket for your SOC analyst to investigate. And so like for me, this becomes very important because not only do I now have to focus on understanding Windows internals and Linux internals to understand, how vulnerabilities are exploited, how exploits work, or how certain, techniques, various TTPs are used. But I also now have to understand how to work with data in an intelligent way, using something like Jupyter Notebooks or using something like Hadoop or Spark. And so you see this collision between, the security world and the data analytics world, and it's becoming very powerful. On one hand, it raises, the bar for us, because now you need more skills to be competitive in the industry. But at the same time, it also makes it super, super exciting because now you can do this really in-depth analysis and you can automate all of it so that you go and actually find the bad guys quicker and in a more automated fashion. Anyway, so yeah, that's really all that I wanted to talk about. Does anyone have any questions or comments or wants to ask me more about this? I do use Jupyter Notebooks at work. I've written quite a few myself to do some correlations on data. So if you do have any questions, I would love to hear them.
I think also in the interest of time, I need to move on for
Sounds
the
good.
next section. But before I move on, if anybody does have questions for Luai, please DM him, asking the stream questions. He'll try to get back to you. We did have another executive that wanted to talk about some talks he saw, which was Jem, but he's currently kind of out of commission. So I'll quickly briefly go over the talks he really liked or enjoyed. The first one being a talk on mail-in voting by a 13-year-old, which was crazy, but this is the most in-depth I've ever heard anybody talk about mail-in voting. She talks about security behind it and risks associated with it. It's really, really detailed, really awesome. Second talk Jem wanted to talk about was biometrics and forging, or at least creating 3D printing parts to fool biometrics, which was also great talk. The next one was I believe we even talked about this in news, was macros in like Office docs and using those to break out of, like, they were breaking out of sandboxes and exploiting certain vulnerabilities associated with that and getting into Apple devices. At least getting in Apple devices using Microsoft products. That was also a great talk. And finally, this one was crazy computer math heavy, but also like really, really interesting. If you guys are up for the challenge of understanding what the hell is going on here, this was some guy cracking zip encryption. I can't get more detailed beyond that. It was very hard to follow, but very intriguing as well. I'll post a link to all these stories that we talked about that Jamie, Luai, and Jem recommended. But I will, because we are going to be running late, I will take a 5-minute break before we start the next segment. So we will resume at 8:07, and we will resume with Alex talking about attacking Active Directory. So yeah, Alex, you can start, and we can get your stream set up while we wait. But yeah, 5-minute break, everybody.
Cool.
Sorry, there we go. Oh no, it's gonna go. There we go. Animations. Amazing.
Alrighty, I am live.
Okay. See. Nice. Yeah, you're here. Okay, awesome. So
Sweet. Okay.
3 more minutes, and then we'll start.
Alex is excited. He wants to go.
Alex is revved up. I'm excited.
So am I.
I was getting water. Yeah, looking forward to it. Hopefully it's helpful.
We know it is, Alex, because we've already seen it.
Cheers, boys.
Yeah, I posted all the DEFCON talks in the resources tab. If anybody's interested in what we were talking about.
Alex, is Sasha Kozlov your sister, your wife?
So oh no, that's me, and I'm not gonna live that down. Thanks, guys. No, so because Russian family, oh god, oh man, so Russian family, old tradition. I'm from there, born in Moscow, so tradition to nickname your kid Sasha, especially if they're Alexander. So I'm Alexander or Alexandre, and so now I am Sasha, but it's not a girl's name. All right, it's not.
Interesting. No, it's totally fine. It's fine. That's not what I expected, but it's fine.
I have many friends who technically their name is Sasha, but only their parents call them that.
Yep, and I made that YouTube account when I was a wee lad, so. Yeah.
So I'm confused. Should I call you Alex, Sasha?
Alex is perfect. Let's stick with that.
Stick with Alex.
let's not.
Sasha's for mom and dad, okay?
Sounds good. Sounds good.
This is what I get for not making a proper alt account on YouTube. It's my fault. No worries.
All right. I think we're about ready to start. I mean, you're going to introduce yourself way better than I'm going to introduce you, but I'll give a shot. Our next guest, Alex Kozlov, is the team lead for the penetration testing and red team divisions at Access 2 Networks. So we got big guest here. He's going to tell us a little bit about, attacking Active Directory as told through Hack the Box. So, I know we don't go over Active Directory very much in this program, but I think it's a very important part of InfoSec because it's pretty prevalent throughout the industry. So, yeah, without further ado, Alex, take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Thank you. I appreciate the intro, too. Alrighty. Hey, people. How's it going? My name is Alex, and tonight I'm going to be walking you through an Active Directory attack as told through a Hack the Box machine. I really liked the format that the previous talk was done, where they kind of walked through the box and did a live demo while explaining what they were doing, and then going over the actual exploitation during the second half. So I totally just copy-pasted. Well, I didn't copy-paste, but I used their format, and my talk will be kind of the same. But one thing with my talk, or with this one, is that I'm only going to be focusing on the user flag for this presentation. And the reason for that is because the exploit chain or the kill chain needed to actually get to root access is a whole other can of worms. If there's enough interest and if enough people yell at me about it, I'll definitely, I'm down to put together a part 2 for this. So a quick overview of the talk. We're going to be walking through obtaining the user flag on a retired machine in Hack the Box called Forest. In order to do that, we're going to be leveraging Active Directory and abusing Kerberos a little bit. More on that later. The attack itself that we're going to be using is called ASREP roasting, or ASREP roasting if you don't want to swear in front of your clients. And then I'll be talking about some things to keep in mind for the red team as well as the blue team. For red, we'll be talking about OPSEC considerations and possible artifacts. And for the blue team, we'll be talking about some detection, mitigation, and prevention strategies. And I'll also be kind of trickling out some advice and things like that. Quick note for the beginners or for people that want to get into pen testing and red teaming and who aren't too familiar with it. There might be a couple of things during this talk that you may not understand, or that you may, not catch the first time. And you know what? That's totally okay. If all you get out of this presentation is just like a list of keywords and topics that you're going to go and dig into on your own and check out on YouTube and look up write-ups, I'm a happy man. The talk has done its job. I've done my job. Everything else is definitely a bonus if I can explain it properly. So a little bit about myself. My name is Alex. I work as a senior consultant or a team lead at Access to Networks, or A2N. When I say I manage the pen testing and red teaming division, that's like 3 guys. It's me and 2 other guys, one of whom is currently on vacation. But in essence, what it comes down to is any offensive security engagement that we have. So anything from like a typical vulnerability assessment, a quick scan, that kind of stuff, all the way up to something like a sophisticated red team engagement or, spear phishing exercise, physical security, et cetera, that kind of gets funneled through us. And we kind of deal with, so on my behalf, I work with the sales team quite closely, and then I work with our team to kind of, work together. In addition to that, I also do some R&D on the side as well to kind of streamline our processes for doing these engagements. I'm a Sheridan grad. I graduated from this program. I'm really, really happy to see how much it's grown. It's quite crazy. I think there's like a few alumni in the chat who can attest to it. When we did this program, there was only 30 of us, and like the first week we were told that maybe 30% of us would be left or something like that. It was ridiculous. And I also got my OSCP. A quick disclaimer about the talk though. Any thoughts, comments, curse words, controversial opinions, they are completely my own. They don't represent Access to Networks. I'm doing this of my own kind of accord. It has nothing to do with them. If you get upset with this talk, yell at me, don't yell at them. Cool. So I'm not going to go too into Hack the Box. It was talked about previously. There's the YouTube link up there. I'm going to drop that in the chat after this. I was supposed to put to say the timestamp for when this was done. I forgot to, but it was last month. I think it was like July 28th. It was on the last week of July. But if you check out the ISSessions Twitter or the ISSessions YouTube channel, I think the talk, it's basically the talk previous to mine. A couple quick alternatives though. To Hack the Box that I've kind of worked with and can kind of speak to a little bit are Ring Zero, which I started with. I don't recommend you start with that one. I had a lot of trouble with it, like go as a first year and not understanding anything about pen testing. VulnHub, which I found to be the most useful, especially as a beginner. I'm going to recommend, if you are into VulnHub or if you want to get into VulnHub, check out these machines here, Chaoptrix 1 to 5. I started with those, and those will put you into scenarios and situations that you'll deal with in the real world. As an example, you'll download, you might find like a precompiled, or not precompiled, you'll find like a POC script online. What happens if it doesn't work? That'll be a scenario that you'll run into realistically somewhere on a client environment, and that will, and going up against that in these machines will kind of teach you how to identify it, how to fix the exploit, et cetera, et cetera. And the last one is Over the Wire. I got to do Over the Wire more. I didn't do it too much. I only did like the first 10 bandit levels, but I learned a lot about Linux and SSH and whatnot. So I'm going to say it was really, really good, and I recommend it for sure. Alrighty, so a little bit about the machine itself. As I mentioned, it's called Forest. It is a retired machine on Hack the Box. So unfortunately, you will need to buy like a monthly or a yearly VIP subscription. I think for monthly, it's like 12 British pounds, which is like 15, 16 Canadian dollars a month. What is that, like 5 or 6 bowls of ramen or something like that? It'll be fine. It's not too bad of a cost. But you can definitely check out the Chaoptrix CTFs or the Chaoptrix machines as well if you're looking to get into it. But for AD attacks, though, this machine here, Forest, is an awesome introduction to Active Directory attacks. When I was getting into AD earlier this year, the 2 machines that I went up against are Forest and Sauna, and they are absolutely fantastic. They can be tough, especially if you're new to Active Directory, but trust me when I say they are well worth the investment. It will pay off immensely, to the point where the tools and techniques and procedures that I learned while doing those 2 machines, I still use on real world engagements and day-to-day stuff. So to try and keep it, like realistic and for the purposes of this, you can think of when you go up against this machine, think this is the kind of scenario you'd be facing. You've got a rogue device on a network, maybe like a Raspberry Pi or something like that. You're either phoning into it or it's phoning back out to you through a reverse SSH tunnel. You should look into that. They're really useful and cool. But you don't have any credentials. So you can't talk to anything. You can't query any services as far as you know. You don't have any way to access anything with any level of authentication. So I'm going to kind of show you what I would do in such a scenario and how I would move forward with a couple caveats. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to switch over to my demo screen here just to kick off the initial scan. And then that way I can, continue talking while the scan is going in the background. So hopefully this works. Cool. And let's get that kicked off. Awesome. And let's go back to here. Cool. Okay, so for those of you who are new to pen testing and red teaming, what I've done is I've included I guess for want of a better word, like a cyber kill chain for what the typical process looks like for the beginning of a penetration test or a red team engagement. In the beginning, there's recon, then enumeration, identifying vulnerabilities, exploiting them, and then post-exploitation. This isn't official at all, so don't try to compare it to like MITRE or anything like that, or a vendor's life cycle. But it's just kind of meant to serve as a point of reference for those of you who may feel lost at sometimes during the talk, like what phase we're at during a typical engagement. So even though some of you might have noticed I'm running an Nmap scan for this exercise, honestly, in a real world engagement, I wouldn't do that. And I don't know many that would. And the reason for that is because of something called OPSEC, or operational security. And what I mean by that is what we just did is, think of it like from the vendor side where, a rogue device, or not a rogue device, an unknown device that they've never seen before is all of a sudden running an internal port scan and, doing a very, very intense port scan, scanning all the ports, trying to enumerate services, OS detection against a bunch of machines, in this case, one machine, but you typically do it against a bunch of machines or a range of IPs. So that's quite noisy, and it's very easy to stand out. And on top of that, a lot of EDR, enterprise detection and response products, can very, very easily flag this type of behavior. So I wouldn't actually do that, but again, this is a lab, and for the purposes of moving forward, I did decide to use Nmap. For those of you that are interested as to what I would do if this was like a real world engagement, and what I have done in this scenario, is I use a combination of tools. I use NSLOOKUP and DNS Recon to identify, the kind of machine and get the intel that we're going to get. You should look into those. They're really good. Next up, I'm going to talk about the flags that I used as well. And if you're trying to go for your OSCP, these might help. I hope they do anyways. So the first flag I use here is -SCV. It just does, it runs an Nmap script scan and an Nmap service scan. You can use -A. The reason I didn't, and I don't typically use -A, is because I believe that like the OS detection probes on Nmap, by default anyways, are quite slow, and there's faster ways to get the same information that you're getting. And you'll see what I mean by that in just a few minutes. -T4 is the second fastest Nmap scanning option. I don't recommend T5 just because I think it was mentioned last time that it can lead to crashing some services, which is definitely an issue. But in addition to that, I've also run into a scenario where, because the probes are moving so fast, Nmap doesn't always interpret the probes correctly, and so I've run into false positives with that. This next one I don't see talked about a lot, but I think it's like incredibly essential, and it really helped me out during the OSCP. So typically, for those of you who are familiar with Nmap, you know that when you run a port scan, and for those who don't, this might be a good thing to know. When you run a port scan with Nmap, typically, if you don't run it with these flags, this flag here, you have to wait until the scan is done to get your output, which is good, but there's actually a better way, in my opinion, of getting results in addition to that. What if I told you that if you just increase the verbosity of your scans by using -VV, I think you can use -V. I didn't test, I use -VV just because I like getting the extra information that comes with it. But if you specify that, Nmap will tell you as soon as it sees an open port, even if the scan's not done. So what that means is if you're running a port scan and it sees like port 80 in the first 10 seconds, as soon as it sees it, it'll notify you that, hey, I found this port open on this IP address. And that alone will save you so much time, both in the labs and in the exam. So I definitely recommend using that and kind of moving forward with that as well. In a real world engagement, if you were to do a port scan, like on an external pen test or something like that, having that -VV means you can start running additional reconnaissance tools on the services while your Nmap scan finishes. Just an overall handy flag that is super useful and I don't see talked about nearly enough. And that last one here, -P-, that's just shorthand for scan all 65,535 TCP ports. So let's go back to our Nmap scan and take a look at what we got. Oh, it's finished. Sweet. So looks like we've got a bunch of open ports here. So let's make a note of some of the key services. So we've got port 53, we'll make a note of that. We've got port 88, which we'll make a note of that too. Nice. Microsoft Windows Kerberos, cool. And we even get the server time, very nice, very nice. 135 RPC, 139 NetBIOS, very cool. 389 LDAP, so Microsoft Windows Active Directory LDAP. We've got a domain name now, awesome, and we've even got a site name too, just from finding this port. 445, which is SMB, and look here, we got Windows Server 2016 standard, and we even got the release number. So that's kind of what I was referring to. Of course, you should always trust but verify this intel, but it's kind of, at the very least, it's a good starting point of what you may be up against here. We also got a work group, which is very, very cool. 464, cool. 593, 636, 3268, 3269, 5985. So we'll make a note of this one too. Those of you who might not be familiar with this port and why it's important, I'll go into it in just a few minutes. But let's make a note of, so we made a note 53, 88, 139, 445, 5985. I think that's pretty much it. These are all important too, don't get me wrong, but in terms of what we're doing here, which is we're trying to identify what kind of machine we're up against, the services that we've identified are more than enough to continue and kind of go through our deduction. Also got an unrecognized service, which is the DNS stuff. No worries about that. We'll get into that. Here's the results of the script scan. Again, SMB OS discovery gives you the OS number and the release number, the computer name. So not only do we have the OS number and the domain, but we've also got the machine account name on the domain, which is awesome. All right, cool. So let's go back to the presentation. Okie dokes. So we enumerated 53, 88, 139, 389, 445, and 5985. So here's the services that each of those correlate to, and I'll quickly give a brief description about each of them. 53 is DNS. DNS is used for hostname resolution. In short, if you're connected to an internal corporate network and you type in like youtube.com or ISSessions.ca or SheridanCollege.ca, whatever you're doing, typically your request is going to be resolved by an organization's internal DNS server. There's 88, which is Kerberos. Kerberos is used for authentication. Again, I'm going to get more into this later on. 389 LDAP, so awesome. LDAP is directory services. It's not necessarily just Active Directory. LDAP stands for Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, which doesn't just correspond to Active Directory. There is other implementations of it. I've not seen it, but I have to say that because there's probably one environment out there that uses something that's not Active Directory. 139 and 445 is for SMB. SMB is server message block. That's typically used for sharing files and printers and for being broken too, but that's neither here nor there. And finally, port 5985. This one's might be new to some of you guys. No worries. What this is WinRM, or Windows Remote Management. So as it's in the name, it stands for remote management. I strongly recommend you look into it on your own time because it's kind of out of scope for the purposes of this talk. We will be leveraging it but I won't be going into what it is. All I'll give you for now is it communicates using something called SOAP calls, which I'll let you look into on your own. So since we can see all of these ports, typically in most Active Directory environments, if you see all of these ports open, most likely you're dealing with something called a domain controller, or a DC. And the domain here is htb.local, or hackthebox.local. For those of you not familiar with a domain controller, this is a machine that in essence holds the keys to the kingdom. The professional Microsoft definition of it says that it's used for authentication requests and verifying users. What that means, though, is anytime that you want to authenticate to a resource, anytime that you want to log in to a resource, local or remote, you're talking to a DC, unless you're not connected to it, in which case verification is done remotely for local stuff. But again, that's out of scope for this talk. And if that's not convincing enough for you, it also happens to contain the password hashes of every single Active Directory user in the domain, among other things. So super, super key machine to identify. It's very important to know where they are. It's a big target. Pwning one of these or compromising one isn't necessarily your end goal, but it's still a huge milestone to pop a domain controller. So for the next part, I'm going to go back. I'm going to actually talk about one thing real quick. Can I go back? Yeah, I can. Sweet. So before I go into what we just saw, which was the LDAP surge stuff, I'm going to talk about how to kind of approach attacking one of these machines. So we've got the services here. There's a couple things we can do. You know, I'm sure that we can, you know, fingerprint the DNS server version. We've already fingerprinted the SMB server version, and maybe there's like a POC exploit. I know there was like a DNS exploit of some kind that did code execution. We can probably use like SMB Ghost to pop the SMB server or something like that. But typically, I wouldn't actually recommend doing that. And the reason is you are exploiting those services, which means that you are causing those services to behave in a way that they aren't supposed to. Now, remember what I just said about this being a domain controller and it kind of being the central point for authenticating to resources. Now, imagine like exploiting the DNS service or the DNS server. Best case scenario, you'll execute your code and maybe the DNS service may behave in like a funky way. Worst case scenario, though, you crash that service as a result of your exploit. And because internal endpoints or internal machines in a corporate environment use DNS for hostname resolution, you just brought down DNS like resolution, resolving host names for an organization potentially. Hopefully they have multiple DCs. But even in a best case scenario, because you're using like a publicly available proof of concept exploit, that's honestly most likely going to get detected. Same goes for SMB. Yeah, we can pop it, but you know, best case scenario, you'll most likely get detected because the POC or the exploit has been signatured, which means that you know, antivirus vendors and defensive vendors are aware of the public exploit and they can, you know, see it coming. Worst case scenario, you'll crash the SMB service, and again, you're crashing it for a domain controller, which is no bueno. So what do? You know, how do we approach a box like this? Well, what I would actually do is I would start with looking at the LDAP service and seeing if there's any way that we can interact with it and see if there's what kind of information we can get from the LDAP service. And the way I would do that in Linux is through a tool called LDAP search. Now, what LDAP search is, it's a Linux tool, and it's used for LDAP query searches. So you can think of it as kind of like a way to connect to an LDAP port and try to pull information from it. It can be used to dump information about the entire domain and Active Directory setup. So things like users, groups, service accounts, computer account names, ACLs or access control list, which define what resource can talk to what, permission levels, a bunch of crazy stuff that we as attackers would really, really want to know. But hang on a second. We have no credentials. So how can we pull this information? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to check for something called a null bind query. That's just a fancy way of saying anonymous access allowed. You can think of it like an FTP server that allows anybody to connect to it, that allows anonymous access and allows them to download whatever data they want. They can't upload data, they can't write to it, but they can take whatever information they want. This is pretty dangerous because it now means that anybody, regardless of authentication, can just hop on the network, connect to the domain controller, and dump the entire like hierarchy of an Active Directory database or domain, which is pretty nutty. So let's go back here and see if we can do a null query or a null bind query on the domain. So LDAP search is also out of scope for this talk here, but I will give you a quick hint. This is how we're defining our query, and we're just saying we're looking for anything related to htb.local domain, and here's our host, which is the IP address of the domain controller in this case. So we just ran it. We got a bunch of data back. I'm not going to go too into it. I've instead dumped all of the output to something called LDAP search output.txt, and I'm going to show you how to like what I would typically do in a real world environment if I found something like this and what kind of information I would look for. So we're going to cat the file. And what we're going to do is we're going to grep for, let's start with something like employees. So an employee, you know, well, most typically what we're trying to do here is we're trying to find out more intel about the organization. You know, what kind of usernames do we have? Like what kind of accounts are they? What groups are these people part of? So let's look for employees here. Looks like we've got a bunch of information. Cool. Information technology, very nice. Exchange administrators, so we know Microsoft Exchange is installed. Sebastian Caron, awesome, cool. So we've got a name. Looks like he's part of the IT group. Cool. Developers, Santi Rodriguez. Oh, she's part of developers, which is in IT. Okay, awesome. We'll make a note of her. Lucinda Berger, IT management, awesome. Information technology, excellent. Andy Hislop, help desk, also part of IT, awesome. We'll make a note of that too. Mark Brandt, sysadmins, very cool. And looks like that's it. We're going to grep for one more thing, and I've mentioned it a couple times here, and we're looking for something called a service account, which I'll get into in just a second. Cool. So manage service accounts, manage service, yes, service, SVC. Whoa, SVC Alfresco. That looks like a username to me. So we'll make a note of that, and we'll treat it as a username for now. Now, typically, what you would do once you have the names of employees, you would go through your LDAP search output and try and match them to a username, which should be in the dump there. But in the interest of time, I'm going to skip that step, and I'll leave it to you to do on your own time. Cool. So let's review what we've identified. We've got username. I've already identified these for us ahead of time. So we've got Sebastian, Lucinda, Andy, Mark, Santi, and this SVC Alfresco account. Now, I want to talk about this last one a little bit more, and we're kind of focusing on that one for today. So this is a service account. Now, a service account is kind of like a user account in Active Directory, but a tiny bit different. Typically, most user accounts have a human associated with them, whereas a service account doesn't. That's because a service account is a dedicated account that is designed for a service or automated job. As an example, let's say that you wanted to back up like an SQL server, a database, every night at 2 a.m., you know, just outside of business hours. Well, you're not going to get your sysadmin to wake up at 2 a.m. to do this unless you want him to quit. So what you would do is you would have him or have somebody else create a service account that all it's going to do is authenticate to the SQL server, export the database, and that's it. And then, you know, maybe write to a text file, hey, I was successful. If there's any errors, log the errors so that way you can review them. As attackers, we love service accounts because in order to access the resource that it needs to access, it can't type in a password because remember, there's no human being associated with that, which means it needs some other way to be able to authenticate to the SQL server or authenticate to a resource. And typically it would use Kerberos authentication for doing that, which I've mentioned earlier. Awesome. So now I'm going to talk about how we can attack this using a tool suite called Impacket. Impacket is awesome, by the way, and I strongly recommend you guys all check it out on your own time. I'm not going to go into it, but I'll give you a quick rundown. Impacket is just a collection of tools in Python that is designed for working with different network protocols. That's it. It's become my new bread and butter for engagements. It's fantastic. just the test scripts alone and the example scripts that they provide in the GitHub repo are like more than enough to get you what you need, or get the goods in this case. Today's focus is going to be on a particular test script called getNPUsers.py. Now I'm going to explain what it does, and then we're going to run it against the domain controller in the demo here. So getNPUsers.py is a script that all it's going to do is query an Active Directory domain, and it's looking for users, or if we give it a user, it'll look for that user to check to see if they have a special flag set. And the name of that flag is do not require Kerberos pre-authentication. More on that later. Don't worry about that right now. All you need to know for the purposes of now is if the flag is set, we're going to get something back called a ticket granting ticket, or a TGT. All right, so we're going to go ahead and try that first, and then I'll go into the next kind of part of this. So go back to my command list. So I'll run through this one for you guys. So here we are calling the script itself. We're specifying the IP address of the domain controller. Here's the domain name that we identified earlier. And you would typically try this for all the user accounts, but you can honestly just start with service accounts. You can most users don't have this flag set. Service accounts are the ones that tend to have this flag set. So we're going to skip them and just go straight for the service account here. And what's very important, and in order to get this technique to work, is you need to make sure you specify no pass. That means we're telling the script not to supply a password and to attempt Kerberos authentication without a password. So let's see what happens. Boom. Awesome. So like I said, we're getting a ticket granting ticket, a TGT. And here is what the output of that looks like. Here's what a TGT actually looks like. It's encoded. I believe this is base 64. I could be wrong though, so don't take my word here as gospel. But we're going to make a note of it, and I've already dumped it into a file called what'sthis.asrep. Don't worry about that for now, but just know that we ran the script, we specified the IP, we specified the username, and we got back a TGT. So, I mean, that's cool. So what? Why care about this? Why is this a big deal? Why am I getting so hyped up over this? Why am I doing this talk in general? Well, before I explain that, I need to introduce one last tiny little tool, not that well known. It's called Hashcat. So what Hashcat is it's open source password cracking software. That's what it's defined as. It's a password cracker. You give it a password, or you give it an encrypted kind of password hash, and it spits out a password if you give it the right word list. What's cool about it though is that it has support for over 300 different hash types, including a mode or supporting the hash type of TGTs, or ticket granting tickets. So now that we know this, let's see what happens if we run Hashcat against this TGT, which we stored in this file here called what'sthis.asrep. So back to my commands here. I'll explain the Hashcat commands for you just before I run it. So calling Hashcat. Hashcat, it's since it is, a cat type program, sometimes it just doesn't want to behave. Sometimes it just kind of wants to do its own thing. So in order to make sure it behaves the same way every time, you have to add in this flag -- force. Joking aside, it doesn't support my virtualized CPU, so it won't run unless I give it this flag. And if you give it this flag, it'll say, okay, fine, but don't submit any bug reports. This is how we're specifying the mode. The mode in this case is the type of hash. We're telling Hashcat what kind of hash it's working with. And this number, if you were to look up this number in the Hashcat lookup table for hashes, this corresponds to the TGT or the ASRep TGT format. Here's the file name that I talked about. And lastly, we need to give it the word list. The word list we're using here is called rocku.txt. You should check this out on your own time. And we're going to be dumping it to a file called cracked. So let's see what happens if we run this. Cool. Yeah, Hashcat doesn't like me doing that. We know about this. Temperature, abort trigger disabled. Yes, thank you. Let's check the status. Oh, cracked. Heyo. Looks like we got it. So if we take a look and do an ls, we've got our cracked file here. So what happens if we now cat the cracked file? Okay, cool. We've got our TGT and whoa, I think that looks like a password to me. So what we're going to do now is we're going to try and see if this is indeed a password. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to use a program called Evil WinRM, which is a program that leverages the Windows Remote Management Service to authenticate to a resource. Definitely recommend you check this out on your own time. So Evil WinRM, we're just going to give it the IP address of the host, the username, and let's now give it the password and see what happens. No, the password is not the same command over again. All right, let's do it. Establishing connection. Boom. Whoa. Looks like we now have a command shell. More importantly, we're running PowerShell on the domain controller here as the user svc alfresco. So let's cd to their home directory, do a quick ls. Got a bunch of things here. Oh, looks like the desktop was the most recently written to folder. So let's cd on over to there. Do a quick ls. Oh, a user.txt. What happens if we type that user.txt? Boom. We just got the user flag for the Forest machine. Awesome. Now, what just happened? We ran a script, right? And we got something, we got a ticket granting ticket, and we somehow got a password out of that. What exactly did we just do? Well, in order to understand that, I'm first going to have to, I've been calling back to it a lot, so it's now going to make its debut. I'm now going to explain a little bit about Kerberos authentication, or the Kerberos protocol itself. So here's kind of a quick, quote unquote, Kerberos overview. For the beginners out there, and especially for those of you who are new to Kerberos, don't worry if you don't understand this. This is like the toughest part of the talk, I would say. To give you an idea of how tough this part of the talk is, or how part this is a slide that was put together by a guy named Benjamin Delpy, or Gentle Kiwi. He wrote this like tool that, I don't know, not too many people use it. It's called Mimikatz. It's not like a big thing. It is. You should check it out. That's a joke. But the name of this talk that he put together is Introduction to Kerberos. Sorry you guys don't get it. So don't feel bad about not understanding it. We're not going to be going in depth to it, especially for these last steps here, because they're actually don't matter. We're only going to be covering the first two steps because that's what is important for the attack. So to understand Kerberos, basically what happens when you want to request access to a resource on a domain, like maybe you want to, access a share. So the first thing you do is you put in your credentials into your machine, and those credentials get passed to a process on your machine called LSAS, or the Local Security Authority Subsystem Process. This is where credentials are cached. So when you authenticate to your Windows machine, your credentials are cached in LSAS. And whenever you type in credentials to access another resource, they also get put into LSAS. Mimikatz plays with LSAS, and that's why it's a really cool tool, and you should definitely check it out. Anyways, so what LSAS will do is it will take your credentials, and depending on the encryption protocol that is set, which is, I believe, negotiated with the domain controller, it's going to choose one of these types of encryptions. These two, by the way, just as an aside, for those of you who want to do more research, these two are important for another type of attack called Kerberosting. So if you're interested in that, you'll want to pay attention to these. But for now, basically what you need to know is the credentials get manipulated using one of these encryption protocols, and that encrypted message is then sent to the KDC, I think that's Key Distribution Center. Doesn't matter. It's port 88 on the domain controller, or the Kerberos port. And it's sent over a message called the ASREC, or the Authentication Service Request. Okay. Now, what the DC is going to do is it's going to receive this ASREC. It's then going to confirm the credentials are valid, and if they are, it's going to send back an ASREP, or an Authentication Service Reply. And on top of that, it's also going to give you something called a Ticket Granting Ticket, or a TGT. Okay? That's it. We're done the Kerberos part now. We're done the hard part. You can all breathe easy. So let's talk about the attack itself a little bit more. So the attack itself, ASRep roasting, it attacks only the first two steps of Kerberos authentication. So that's why we only spoke about those two. Basically, as I just kind of explained, usually in order to get this TGT, this ticket granting ticket, you're going to require credentials. Usually no creds, no TGT. If you need like a fancy way to explain this on a report, you can use pre-authentication. That's like the official term for this. But no creds, no ticket. But what happens if there's a flag that's set that says pre-authentication is not required? Well, in that case, anyone is allowed to send this ASRec message on behalf of that user that this flag is set for, and they'll be able to get back a TGT. Awesome. And on top of that, the way that we got the password is that TGT happens to be encrypted with a user account's NTLM password hash, which we would then typically exfiltrate and save offline to perform password cracking. I believe you can also do pass the ticket with this, but I'm not sure, so don't quote me on that. But that's basically how we went from no credentials to discovering an encrypted TGT and decrypting it and getting a password. Cool, awesome. I hope that made sense. I always feel like this dude from It's Always Sunny whenever I explain this, so I really hope that made sense. Okay, awesome. Now what? I mean, we just went from no credentials to one credentials. What would you do next? What would I do next? Well, what I would do next in this scenario is I would then enumerate the account permissions and access that we know we have. The question that I'm always asking myself whenever I've got a new piece of intel, and I strongly recommend that you ask yourself this question whenever you learn something new about an environment or an asset, is what can I do with this? What can I access with this? What can I do with this that I couldn't before? As a result of me getting this piece of intel, what can I now do with it? What can I touch? What am I allowed to now authenticate to? What resources can I access? Can I now query the domain using my credentials to see something that I wasn't able to see before? We can now enumerate the domain with a whole new level of access. And from there, we would then put together an attack plan. And the way that we would perform these last two steps is through a tool called Bloodhound. Bloodhound is sweet. You should definitely look into it. I'm not going to go too into it. I'm going to kind of just hype it up. Especially, I will mention, though, is that it has been talked about previously by Laura Harris. And it was actually done in the ISS sessions as part of the ISS sessions meetup. It was, I think it was in June. I don't remember the specific date, but I'm pretty sure, and some of the club members might have to correct me here, it should be the talk before the Hack the Box talk, the first one there. Am I?
Yep. It'll be our June talk by Laura Harris.
June talk by Laura Harris. Sweet. Thank you. But just to kind of hype it up, if you're not already, into Bloodhound, already, thinking about why it's awesome, when you download the tool and set it up, here is a list of all of the pre-built queries that the Bloodhound developers have made for you. So these are not custom queries that I wrote. These are pre-generated queries that the Bloodhound developers package into every Bloodhound install. So it's literally like a one-click, you put your Bloodhound data in, and then you just click find all domain admins, find the shortest path to the domain admins, map domain trusts. And if you look all the way down to the bottom, find ASRep roastable users, or users that don't require pre-authentication set. And that's it. So now let's talk about some considerations from the red team side. So the reason I like Active Directory attacks so much, in addition to them kind of being, just abusing built-in features really, or built-in misconfigurations, is, well, from a defender's perspective, in this particular case, all we did was request a TGT. We didn't exploit anything. We didn't pop anything. We didn't, we didn't do anything out of the ordinary for the most part, that would easily throw up a flag. We would generate these two events, these Windows event ID 4768, which translates to, someone requested a TGT for this user, and 4625, which is account failed to log in. This one's interesting. I looked into this because I was like, well, we didn't actually fail to log in though. Like we just, pre-authentication wasn't set, so we didn't authenticate. Well, it turns out that in order for this to work, basically what happens on the back end is when we sent that using get NP users, when we sent in that SVC alfresco, we technically still provided a password. It was just essentially blank or like a null value. But because this don't require pre-authentication flag was set, the DC said, yeah, that's fine. It doesn't matter if the login fails. Here's your TGT. Here's your ticket. Now, what's cool about these two events is these are common events in most organizations. Remember, whenever you authenticate to the domain controller in order to access a resource, this event is going to get generated. And that happens like, once every 10 seconds, 10 to 30 seconds, and I'm probably being conservative there. This one, account failed to log in, might not happen as much. But again, this is a bit harder to detect than something like, hey, someone's running CVE, whatever, against, the DNS service as an example. But caveat there, it's always stealthy until someone is looking for it. So this could be incredibly stealthy, or this could be the loudest thing in the room and it could stick out like a sore thumb if you're got the right logging enabled, if you're, if you're parsing the logs correctly and you've got the proper filters up, this is going to stick out like a sore thumb. And going back to with Active Directory, I found that like in general, AD attacks they're not harder to detect, but they are less so detected. I hope that makes sense. So let's now move over to the blue team side. So what can blue do? How can they detect this, mitigate it? Is there any way to prevent this? Yes, yes, and yes. So for detection and mitigation, what you can do is you can review AD accounts and look for those that don't require pre-authentication. Bloodhound is a great tool for that. Remember, all you have to do is run the ingester, get all the domain information, then toss it into Bloodhound, click on that query, and boom, you've got all your accounts that don't require pre-auth. It's great. But in case your sysadmin doesn't let you run it, in case you're not allowed or some corporate policy against it, here's a PowerShell one-liner to get around that. But I know that PowerShell is also blocked, but there's other ways of running that PowerShell command. I'll leave that to you to look into. So how can you actually prevent this? Honestly, the biggest way, or one of the easiest ways, is just to use strong passwords. That's it. It's not like a big. I mean, I guess it is a big thing, but it's not difficult. If the attacker gets the ticket granting ticket and the password is like, a long phrase or something like that, or like a 30 character randomly generated password, then it's not like it's going to be much harder to crack if it's even going to get cracked. And most likely most operators would just give up after if they eventually see that, they'd be like, oh, well, I'm not going to, go after that. In addition, for like detection stuff, if you see a bunch of 4768 and 4625, remember, this means that someone requested a TGT, but they're also failing to log in. If you see a bunch of these events in tandem for like 5 users in 30 seconds, at the very least, that's an anomaly, and that's something that should be looked into. And finally, this is a big thing. Whenever you're creating or configuring service accounts, whether that's something you're just trying to automate part of your like day-to-day tasks, or if like a vendor's coming in and they're like, we need to set up a service account, apply the path of least privilege. So review the permissions that this account has, and also review if it really does not need pre-authentication. Is there any other way that you can access the resources that you need as a service account without turning off pre-authentication, which lets anybody grab the encrypted password hash? And same goes for a vendor service account. If the vendor tells you can't change the default password, and the default password is like root or something, and the vendor says, no, well, this account needs DA in order to be able to perform its functionality, maybe take a look into that, and maybe audit it and take a look and see if they really do need that level of permissions, especially with a password like that. Okay, awesome. So yeah, in conclusion, I think understanding Active Directory is essential to pen testers and red teamers. I think it's especially, you know, in the past couple of years, it's really, from my perspective, really blown up in terms of you know, being used and understanding, and kind of like there's a lot more eyes on it than I think there were before. And I think that it provides a lot of levels of access and a lot of ways to get the same information that, you know, popping boxes and you know, performing lateral movement in like a traditional manner can get you, and in a typically stealthier way. But with that, OPSEC. That is, it's incredibly important that it's you understand what your tools are doing. Now, I said the word artifacts earlier, and what an artifact is, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, an artifact is like a trace or a footprint that your tool leaves. Basically, any action that you perform, whether it's like establishing a session or just running like the dir command or something like that, or who am I, that is leaving a trace or an artifact somewhere. It's either being logged, or it's being, you know, made a note of, or, you know, maybe you're touching a file that's the timestamp is updating. And understanding what artifacts your tools and your scripts and whatever you're using and your techniques and procedures leave behind is the key between a successful operation and blowing your cover. So much so that you would, like, I would say you even need to have an appreciation for it. You need to really appreciate the tradecraft behind the TTPs, tools, techniques, procedures that you're doing in order to really, you know, understand the environment and be able to move around it in a successful manner without getting caught. Now, and I've got a couple pieces of advice for in this slide and the next slide as well. If you want to, you know, learn more about this stuff, I strongly recommend, or look for, you know, getting more into pen testing and red teaming. I strongly recommend you look for realistic machines on Hack the Box. If you need an example, check out Sauna, or go ahead and Root Forest. Those are both great boxes that'll keep you occupied for quite a while, I would say, especially if you're new to this stuff. The next thing I want to kind of say is that I strongly, especially if you're not just like a beginner, but someone who wants to get into pen testing and red teaming, who thinks that that's something they'd want to do, avoid one-click tools and like exploitation frameworks and like pre-built stuff at all costs. And I say that for two reasons, and take it as someone who was once in your position and who went through the exact same stuff that you're going to go through if you run these tools. The first is that it's like you're going to get into like this mentality of like you will run them in your lab environment, and sometimes they'll work. And, you know, you may get into the mentality of like, oh, you know, I can just run this automatic tool and it'll work. But that's not the case. Like, they rarely really honestly work. I'm going to shout out somebody in the chat, Kenny Hartlab or Donuts. We were talking once, and he, after like, I think he's been doing this for 5-6 years, like crazy amount of time. Throughout his entire career, he is, as a red teamer now, he has only ever used Metasploit twice on engagements, and in both situations it was like he'd compromised everything else, and like they had taken care of everything, and they found like some random XP machine, and he was like, I don't want to, you know, deal with this and put everything together, so I'm just gonna, you know, yeet Eternal Blue at it and it'll take care of it for me. That's it. So in addition to not, like, rarely really working, you also don't learn anything. When you know, click run, you're not really getting the understanding of what's going on behind the tool. So I'm very much a concept-oriented person. I think that you need to understand the concepts before even looking at pre-built tools. And then when you look at pre-built tools, then you can start looking, then like once you understand the pre-built tools, then go into the automated frameworks. But you really need to understand what your tools are doing at a high level before you use them. And it goes back to the whole, you know, leaving an artifact. If you don't understand your tool and you don't understand what it's doing, then that means you don't know the artifacts it's leaving behind. And that's a very, very easy way to get caught. So yeah, that's pretty much it. If you want to reach out to me to talk more or to discuss something, I'm Backtrack 2 on Twitter, and I'm also on Discord. More than happy to have like a follow-up conversation. Big thank you to Nicholas Johnston or Rick on Discord, Kenny Hartlob or Donuts on Discord, and most finally, Lee Kagan or Invoke Threat Guy on Twitter. These guys are all awesome. I wouldn't be where I was without these three people, I would say. Yeah. I'm always happy to talk about pen testing and red teaming concepts. So if you just want to, hit me up and reach out and just, chat about something, or even just say like, hey, I looked into something, that's awesome. I'm saying this because I've run into this as someone who was like, who when he was beginning was reaching out to people. I always felt like I had to like either teach someone something or show them something that they may not be familiar with. And don't feel like that. Don't feel like you have to teach us anything like when you reach out to us. Just like, we're just happy to hear that like people are interested in this stuff and people are driven enough to do additional research. That's a big thing. And second to last, there's a lot of misinformation and a lot of hype in our industry, especially when it comes to pen testing and red teaming. I can't count the number of times I've been told that like I'm going to be out of a job because there's going to be like an automated red team solution that's going to do it for me. And like, I'm still here. So, but in regards to that as well, like even the term red teaming has really been, there's no polite way to say this really. I'm just trying to think of like a nice way to say it besides like cannibalized. Yeah, cannibalized. So that term especially has really been kind of mangled by the industry. There's a lot of things that are deemed like red teaming, which aren't like, by really like proper quote unquote red teaming. And my goal is to kind of shatter a lot of this misinformation and hype through the purpose of this talk by talking about like, what people think pen testing and red teaming is like, what people think we do versus what we really do and what kinds of techniques and attacks we really go after and the kind of mindset that we have. Lastly, I'm going to kind of leave you with one piece of advice if you want to succeed in pen testing and red teaming. And that's what is to learn by doing. And I'm going to quickly, give you a small little story. When I was first trying to get into this, I got into it because of Kenny, actually, partially. When that's how I got into the business part of it for pen testing and red teaming. He was basically, talking about some of the things he was learning as part of his gig. And I was kind of just overhearing it, and I was super into it. I was like he was talking about like man in the middle attacks, and like he was able to like see like API keys disclosed in plain text, all this stuff, and I'm like, whoa, like this is crazy, like this is what I want to do. And so I went up to him and I said, hey man, like that sounds really cool. How can I do this? How can I do what you do? How do I even start to do what you do? And he asked me a question, and it's the same, and I'm gonna do the same to you if you reach out to me and ask me like, hey, how do I get started in pen testing and red teaming? I'm gonna do the exact same that you. Is he asked me the question, and the question he asked me is, what do you do when you go home? And I at the time I didn't understand the question, so I was like, well, I go home and take the bus, I make my dinner, play some Hearthstone, I don't know, watch some YouTube, I guess, go to bed. That's about it. And he said, okay, well, what I do when I go home is I'm looking up the latest exploits that are out there. I'm checking out the newest security trends. I'm reading up on some new blog posts that I've documented or bookmarked during the day that I didn't get the chance to go to. I'm following up on like Defcon talks that I made a note of, and now I got some time. I'm looking into it on my own. The big thing is that you need to learn by doing and learn by reading. And that's honestly, that's it. If you follow that, like it's not done me wrong in many years that I've, well, many, like 4 to 6, not even 3 to 5 years that I've done this, and I don't expect it to do me wrong after this. So yeah, that's it. Thanks a lot for listening to me ramble on about this. I've got a couple links up here I'm going to be tossing in the chat afterwards for you guys to do your own digging. But yeah, so if you guys have any questions, any answers, I'm not, in terms of time, like I'm not really, like I'm not doing anything after this. I'm going to go play Fall Guys later. That's pretty much it. So go ahead and hit me up with any questions you guys might have.
Awesome. Yeah. It is late, so don't feel pressured to stay, guys. Thanks for joining us for the entire 2 hours. But yeah, if you guys have any questions, post them in the stream questions chat, or just simply speak up, unmute your mic. We do have a couple, I guess there was a discussion going on with OPSEC in the stream questions. I think it's been answered, but
let's see it. Complementing with Shodan for discovery. Yeah, we can start with that. Yeah, absolutely. What I like about Shodan, MedSprite said it, which is a great question. Absolutely use that with reconnaissance. In this case, because the perspective is an internal network environment, you hopefully wouldn't see the DC exposed externally, but absolutely look into Shodan, especially all you students and former alumni. If you don't know this, Shodan will give you free lifetime. They should still free lifetime like subscriptions to their service and like their API. I think you get like 100 queries or something crazy. It's awesome. All you have to do is send them an email from your Sheridan account. That's what I did, and that's how I got it. So definitely do that.
God, I already paid for it.
I mean, if you got like a discount, then that's also good. Windows remote management. Yes, exactly. Operation security. Yeah, OPSEC means B. Okay, yeah. So did I, Meltdown Monk, did I explain hopefully with the artifacts and stuff? Did I answer your question there for that?
I was just confused. I just hadn't heard the term OPSEC before. I was like, okay, operation security, but I'm actually still confused with the various answers that we got in here.
Okay. No worries. So yeah, go ahead.
If I were to play back what I heard, it was the process of being aware how you're going to get caught, or it's the process of getting caught. But when I looked at Wikipedia, it's the process of identifying information that would be valuable for a red team. So I'm still confused.
No worries. Yeah. So OPSEC, so that Wikipedia definition, it's confusing, but it's essentially right. It's like the part that I talked about with artifacts and kind of
what were you going for, I guess? Yeah.
So with the identifying information that would be beneficial to red teamers, you can think of it like what information do my tools and what information do my techniques and procedures leave behind? So for example, if you were to check out the OPSEC consideration slide, we as red teamers and pen testers need to know that when we perform this attack, ASREP roasting, we're going to create 2 log events, 4768, I think, and 4625. Now, because you know that, you're taking into consideration the OPSEC portion of it. Like, okay, so now I know what my tools are leaving behind. Then you would then basically with that enumerate like, okay, is the client checking for that? Are they reviewing Windows logs? Is there a SIM somewhere where logs are being forwarded to? And if so, is there like Windows logs and data that are being sent over there? And with that, like, are they filtering for it? And are they responding to these kinds of threats? So it's all of these questions all together kind of make up the OPSEC bubble. But whenever I think OPSEC, I think of just like, what traces am I leaving behind? Like, what am I doing to the service by attacking it?
Yeah.
Okay. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Sweet.
Okay. I had kind of a follow-up question. Are you typically just going for one account at a time, or are you trying to Kerberos like an entire domain at once, like every person that you possibly could? I was thinking that could get very noisy very quickly.
Absolutely. And that's before you take into consideration like I forget what they're called. They're like Kerberos dummy accounts. Where basically
you can put in, we do that at the bank, we put in dummy accounts. So
exactly, yeah, absolutely. If you just run the tool that I use for curb roasting is called Rubius, and if you just run it by default with like the curb roast option, it'll do that. It'll try it for all of them. So no, we don't do that. Basically it would depend on what again, it depends on what we're trying to do, and it depends on honeypot accounts. Thank you, Matt. Right. It would just depend on like what we're trying to access. So if our end goal, like the target that we were given by the client is like, we've got a database, somewhere with credit card data or PII or something, and we want you to get there. LDAP query most recent, selective, like 90 days, select a few, attempt crack. Exactly. Yeah. With that as well, you like if you try and identify service accounts that help you, first, and then if you're not getting very far with Kerber roasting those, you would then, do as Donuts is saying, like LDAP query most recent 90 days, select a few, attempt crack.
Cool.
Copy of your PowerPoint presentation slides. Yeah, for sure. I'll dump these slides up in the Discord. I'll, post them on GitHub, like whatever works for you. And I'll link up all the links and stuff I was talking about in the stream questions chat. After I'm kind of done here with the Q&A stuff.
I know, Lou, I had a bunch of questions for you, but it does have to leave. Do you mind answering, maybe do 2 more questions?
I can ask them, Kurt, if you want.
Awesome, go for it.
All right. So yeah, I was just wondering, and I think you touched about this a little bit, on this a little bit. So, how often do you go into like the internals of a technique? Is that something that you do often, or do you find that that's not really necessary for a red teamer? The focus is more so on kind of being resourceful, taking kind of built tools and then maybe modifying them a little bit. So what's your approach on a day-to-day?
Yeah, for sure. I would say that like my expectation of pen testers and red teamers on my team is that they understand the attack in depth before they execute it, because they're responsible for what happens afterwards by executing that like attack or that technique. So in terms of diving into the internals of the attack, I would expect them to, or I would expect that like most red teamers and pen testers too, hopefully, are diving into the internals of the attack. They're maybe not like to, I mean, if that's what it entails, then yeah, absolutely diving down to like doing PCAPs. And looking at like the raw messages that are being sent, which I know that has been done before for researching. Again, some of this research has been done for you. So like for AS rep roasting, I don't need to. I mean, I could run a PCAP, but I know that there's also like blue team write-ups on how to detect this stuff that I can go check out. Things like that. So in terms of, to answer the question of like how often do we dive into the internals of our attacks, all the time. Like every attack before we do it, we have to understand what it's going to do before it does it, because we're responsible for what happens afterwards.
Sounds good. Thank you so much. And then I had just another question as well. So what are kind of like the biggest problems that you see, like, and again, this is from your perspective, that you see in a blue team? Like what techniques do they often detect, and what techniques do they often miss? Just based on the trends that you've seen.
Oof.
Sorry, I know that's a big question.
Oh, no worries. No, it's in terms of what I see doing wrong. My mind was kind of, I was gonna say like password reuse, which I still agree with. Weak passwords and password reuse is still a big one, and definitely a big way that I've seen people get in, and I've heard people like get in. I still hear, I still hear to this day. I would not be surprised if I was to talk to like a colleague and they were like, yeah, so I password sprayed and I did like summer 2020 ! And I got in and I got an account. That would not surprise me. Like that kind of stuff is based on what I've heard. And lack of MFA. I'm just, Kenny, I talk with Kenny a lot. Kenny's like where I get a lot of my like a lot of this input from as well. Like I think he's only, it is. He's only, I think, ever told me once where password spraying like winter 2020 or something like that, or summer 2020 didn't work. It was only one engagement out of like however many he's done. So, and on top of that, lack of multi-factor authentication, absolutely. Like passwords are going to get compromised. Like at some point, a brute force attack is going to work. There's going to be a data breach and you're going to reuse credentials. I'm pretty damn cynical about this part, because like I've heard stories of just like super secure environments just get absolutely like destroyed because somebody was reusing credentials from like the LinkedIn 2016 breach, and they just like, instead of using like 2017, they just updated it to 2020, and MFA would prevent that or like mitigate it somewhat. And it's just the fact that it's not used. And I've had discussions that they really irk me of like, where we'll recommend MFA or like, hey, let's enable MFA, and like it just seems it's been made so easy to implement. It's crazy to me how there's like pushback on it. I can understand some of the pushback where it's like, well, we don't want to support like we don't want to support individual users authenticators, but even then, that's like not really a good argument in my opinion in terms of like not enable, like we don't want to deal with these like minor headaches, so we're not going to enable MFA for our entire organization. It's like, are you for real? So that's a big one. One other thing that I've kind of noticed, especially recently, that I think I want to talk about is it's an OWASP top 10 actually. It's insufficient logging and monitoring. Like logs aren't being like proper logging is not being done to find these kinds of threats, and like it's not being I guess forwarded properly, and like the kind of logs that are being gathered are just logs for the sake of logs, like data for the sake of data. Like it's not really helping anybody. There's no actionable intel from these logs. It's just we have logs, but like logs only matter if A, they're relevant, B, they're being forwarded and like filtered properly, and C, if someone actually is looking at them and responding to them correctly. For the most part, of course, there's always going to be false positives, false negatives, but without that, like those 3 points, implementing logging is going to do nothing. To your next question about like the trends and stuff, it's funny, like Lee and I were talking, and I had a chat with Kenny about this as well, where I was like, okay, so like PS exec is dead, WMI exec is like the new standard for attackers, right? Like for lateral movement, and both of them went, not really, like no, like you'd be surprised, dude. You'd be surprised. It's not really like there's no like standard per se. Like yeah, okay, WMI exec's cool, and yeah, it works and it's good and it's awesome, but PS exec is still like widely used, and still like I still hear and see like just PS exec and PowerShell with like Cobalt Strike defaults working and taking down organizations, and that's like defaults, like barely changing the resource kit or the artifact kit or whatever with Cobalt Strike, like changing anything. So in terms of like trends, I would just say, you can check out like the security news trends to see what's being abused. But in terms of what I've seen works, like password spraying, because no MFA, and like internally, just lateral movement techniques that I've seen work. WMI exec is what I would try and go for. But again, I have seen just long ass PowerShell encoded commands that are clearly malicious and they're being logged, but nothing is being done with that. It's not being sent anywhere. No one's looking at it, so it doesn't matter. Same with PS exec. Yeah, PS exec's pretty like, old in terms of a lateral movement technique, but again, if it's not being logged, if it's not being forwarded somewhere and no one's looking at it, it might as well be invisible.
That's really interesting, because when I first when I asked that question, what I was expecting you to say was like process injection or like something advanced like that. But what you went with was just like password spraying, which has existed since like 1970.
You know what, dude? It's there because it works. Like it's the same with like use strong passwords and why it was in caps in my presentation, because it's still not a thing. There's still weak passwords that are easy to compromise. It's still, and like that's being used for high priority accounts. Yeah, process injection too, for sure. Like that's absolutely being used too. Don't get me wrong, and it's a great technique. But attackers, like threat actors especially, they're going to use what they know works. And that's not a slight against process injection. Process injection is badass. But if an attacker can use PowerShell and PS exec and they know they'll get away with it, they'll use it, because again, it's been done to death, but it works. It's reliable.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks, Alex. Thanks for the amazing presentation, the Q&A. I'd like to thank everybody for showing up. I'd like to thank the exec team for their contributions, and yeah, like a huge shout out to Alex for this really detailed presentation. We're running a bit late, and I do have to go. So if you guys have any more Q&A questions, hit up Alex at Backtrack on Discord, or just post them in the stream questions, and I can try to forward to them. Other than that, yeah, man. Thanks everybody for coming.
Yeah, thanks a lot, guys. All the best. Cheers.
Have a great night.